On this beautiful novel. So Habitations is the story of Vega, a woman who moves from South India to New York for grad school and embarks on an academic career in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book?
Yeah. Is this right? Is this too close? No, it's all right. So Vega is, she's in her 20s when she moves to the U.S., and she spent most of her life in Chennai in South India. But she has been somewhat migratory in that she spent a few of her years in Cleveland in an attempt to get medical treatment for her younger sister, who dies before the novel begins. And that is the event in Vega's life that follows her really throughout her adulthood, throughout the novel, and presumably after the novel ends. And it is, so on an emotional level, she's somebody really bound by this loss and really shaped by it. But on another level, she's somebody who's really brimming with intellectual curiosity and excitement and a belief that the world is within her grasp. And so even before she arrives in the States, she has moved quite a bit. Again, there were the years that she spent in Cleveland that were not of her own choosing. But she also moves for graduate school within India and is somebody who's very much engaged in literature, in political theory, in novels, in plays. And so she has kind of a wandering mind, too. So she's, I think she's somebody who, on an emotional level, is really, really constrained, and then on an intellectual level, somebody who's really unbound.
Yeah, I love that description, and I love Vega so much, and I loved reading this book. It's the kind of novel that, and this doesn't happen to me very often anymore, that you can just really get lost in, like sink into. I was staying up too late reading it. I was putting off deadlines. I just wanted to spend more time with this woman. I was at the grocery store missing her, thinking about her, and just wanted to go back to it. And I have to say, that's just an increasingly rare experience. You know how it is, when you love to read, you love literature, but it's also your job. It's really hard to get lost in a book. And so I was so moved and grateful and felt like I was a little kid with sneaking a flashlight under the covers at night, it's like that kind of book. So can you read a little something for us?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, flashlight, that's the best thing. I feel like we should end now. So I'm going to read a few pages that kick off chapter 5. So it starts on page 46 of the book. And a few things to know about her. She makes a few references to the places she's lived in, the undergraduate institution she attended in Chennai, and then Hyderabad, a city that she spent some graduate years as well. She also refers to a couple of friends, Gayatri, who is a childhood friend of hers who's in India, and Naomi, who's her roommate at Columbia, where she ends up for graduate school. So these pages and much of the novel is set in New York City. And she also references Rukmini, who's her mother. She was one of 2 international students in the class. The other was an Afro-Indian woman named Zamadi, who had been born and raised in Kenya, but had completed her undergraduate at Mount Holyoke, and, unlike Vega, was schooled in American politics. Weeks into the semester, sitting on Zamadi's couch and sipping overly sweetened tea, Vega realized that she didn't recall the last time she had made a friend. She and Gayatri had known each other since primary school, and with Naomi, she wondered if their relationship, at least on Naomi's end, was a function of proximity or obligation. In her early days at Srividya, and then later in Hyderabad, she had watched people break into pairs and had regarded it with a sort of distance and inevitability. Of course they would go off, and she would be left behind. What worried her then, though she hadn't recognized it until this moment, was the same thing that worried her now. People liked her on the surface. She was nice enough and sharp enough. But when they really got to know her, they would find her boring, maybe a little bit depressing. Now she listened to Zamadi talk about her family, the foods she missed from home, the one place in Harlem where you could find decent East African food, though it was overpriced and mostly Somali. Then Zamadi asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" The question made Vega laugh. It was so endearing and childish, the type of question that people posed in books or movies, but never in actual conversation. I don't. Why do you ask? I don't know. It's a defining thing, isn't it, having a boyfriend? That I'm currently undefined. Do you? Nope. Vega glanced at Zamati's bookshelf. I read that during my first master's program, she said. Nervous conditions. Did you like it? Vega paused. I don't know. I like the character, but I'm not entirely sure I understood it. It's hard to appreciate African literature if you aren't African. Maybe Indian literature is the same way. Europeans and Americans might pretend to like the books, but they really don't. It was something Rukmini, as Vega's mother, might say. The kind of overly simplistic comment to which Vega would vociferously disagree, though she would suspect deep inside that Rukmini was right. Maybe, she said. They settled into an easy friendship along with a Pakistani public health student named Halima. On Wednesdays and Fridays, when Naomi was working, Vega ate dinner in one of their apartments. Egg curries and greasy frozen parathas are sometimes leftovers sent by Halima's aunt and uncle in Queens. Vega welcomed those nights. With Naomi, she felt her life being propelled towards something uncertain and exciting. With Zamati and Halima, there was an ease and a coziness, a freedom to fix herself a sack in their kitchens, to kick off her shoes and collapse on one of the couches. They watched terrible television together. She didn't feel the need to impress them. Halima's fiancé, Adnan, was at the University of Massachusetts earning his doctorate in English. There were artsy Polaroids of him scattered throughout her apartment, one in which he was leaning back in a chair and laughing, another in which he was blowing a ring of smoke. Do you think it's odd that Americans don't like to talk about poverty? Vega asked one night. Their class that afternoon, a discussion of welfare reform policies, had been unusually stilted. Now they were at Zamati's place making mushroom curry. Normally, Zamati and Halima did the cooking, and Vega washed the dishes. But Halima was running late, so Zamati set Vega up with a cutting board and a bowl of tomatoes, and Vega got to work clumsily. She had learned in her 2 months in New York that she was a terrible cook. How so, Zamati asked. In class, people will talk about economic stagnation in Europe or Soviet food shortages, but if somebody brings up social welfare programs in the States, nobody speaks. Well, they haven't experienced American poverty. Yes, but they haven't experienced a European poverty either, yet they're happy to talk about it. Zamati was quiet for a bit, concentrating as she measured water for the rice cooker, and Vega wondered if she had said something inane, though she knew it was unlikely. Zamati wasn't inclined towards judgment, and was, in that same spirit, impervious to embarrassment. A few days earlier, she had told Vega and Halima that when she was in secondary school, she and one of her male friends had practiced oral sex with each other nearly every day for a full year. Sorry, kids. What do you mean you practiced? Halima asked. You practiced tennis or penmanship, not sex acts. Vega and Zamati both laughed. Sex acts, Zamati repeated, and Vega felt a new closeness to her. Like with anything, Zamati said, we wanted to understand how to do it. There were no feelings between us. He wasn't cute. He knew he wasn't cute. But he was a funny guy, and nobody else was interested in touching me. Also, we both improved. By the end, I was quite masterful. What a waste to bring such a skill to Mount Holyoke. Halima winced, but Zamati found the comment hilarious, and it occurred to Vega how much she admired this quality in people, the ability to laugh at their own follies and weaknesses and desires.
Thank you for reading that. I love that passage. I love those friendships in the book, and so Vega's friendships are really important throughout the novel, and they also become such an integral part of her particular experience of migration. She seeks out community among others, mostly women who've also come to the United States or who've moved around a lot. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about Vega's friendships and the relationship between friendship and her immigration experience.
Yeah, I loved writing her friends. I really felt like once I had cracked them, and you know, when you write fiction, there's often a moment when you feel as though you cracked the veneer of the story and you're in it, and you go from kind of driving it to watching these characters move around in their world. And once I had cracked that, it was so wonderful to see them just care for each other and to see their relationships shift and to see all the ways in which all the complex ways in which they needed each other. I'm always really interested in friendships or in relationships that start off with a little bit of uncertainty. You're not quite sure the terms of it. And then they turn into something that stays with you and that you find that you couldn't have imagined the person you would be without those. And, I don't know how much I decided who those friends would be. They kind of fell onto the page in some form and then evolved through the revision process. But it was really, really lovely to make their stories part of her story as well. You know, for all of us, we have a pretty narrow experience of of migration, of stasis, whatever it is. It's pretty singular, and so her sense of the world really comes about by getting to know them. They have a lot of fun together.
Yeah, and those scenes with them are so much fun. And she also, Vega is a person who maintains these friendships over decades, and you know, even if they're on the other side of the world, and it's like that, such a beautiful quality in her that she's sort of, I think, not even aware of. It's just like, this is her life, you know. And yeah, I love the friends. So you mentioned at the beginning the death of Ashwini, Vega's sister, and that Vega's grief over Ashwini's death is like just drives this book and informs the structure of it and the decisions that she makes, types of relationships in her life. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit, but can you also read for us that paragraph on page 8, right after Ashwini dies?
Yes. Vega's family? Yes, okay. Vega's family had never been religious, but they observed the customary 13-day mourning period following Ashwini's death. Rukmini's brothers and their families came from Bangalore with their enormous suitcases and booming voices. Vega's paternal grandmother arrived from Madurai and sat on the daybed, looking catatonic, gesturing to Vega when she needed a glass of water or to be helped to the toilet. A Hindu priest came to their door every day to walk them through another round of prayers. To make room for their relatives, Vega spent nights on a pallet on the floor of her parents' bedroom. She hardly slept, and neither did they, though none of them spoke a word. In the mornings, she and Rukmini bathed and draped themselves in stiff white and cotton saris. This was the only time during those 2 weeks when Vega and her mother were alone together. It was when she missed Ashwini most acutely, when she realized how thin their lives had become.
Thank you. So can you talk a little bit about the nature of Vega's grief? So this is when she's 17, what she just read, and then the book moves through so much time. So the ways that her grief drives her, the way she deals with it. And I'm also so curious, like, were you thinking consciously about grief as a writing tool while you were, you know, working on this book?
I don't know. I mean, I've a really close writing group, and they often joke that they have to give only me a trigger warning because I can't handle anything happening to a child, you know, an animal, like an insect. I really struggle with anything that I find objectively tragic happening in a book. I don't want it. I mean, I don't want tragedy to happen in books. I don't want tragedy to happen in the world. And so it was a real effort for me to imagine this loss. I didn't want it in the book. And I think because of that, I really had to work really hard to imagine what it would have felt like. And I really had to extend Vega my full compassion and love, and really imagine how somebody whose choices I would have found, had I known her, probably a little difficult to tolerate. But I was just walking her shoes, and in some chapters, her movement through the city or through that year of her life just felt heavy. She sort of felt bent over by it, but she was trying not to present that way. The other interesting thing that I didn't realize until I was talking about the book after it was written, that because it's set in the 90s, it's set in a time where when our lives are actually a little bit private, that nobody is sharing this information publicly. People know it in her inner circle, but she's able to migrate and leave that behind. There are very few people in her life in the States who know about Ashwini's death. They come up, but they're not talking about it loudly or publicly. They're small in number, and she also comes to a place where she doesn't really have any ties. So she does not have to talk about this. She doesn't have to disclose it. No one's bringing it up. Nobody knows. And so that is she finds solace in that sometimes, but it's also a burden because she's not forced to share any of this, and she's not forced to lean on people in ways that probably they would have allowed her to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a deep, intimate psychological portrait, and it's so moving to see the ways that that this, like, the pain of this loss sort of circumscribes her world even when she's not aware of it. Yeah. So I wanted also to talk about motherhood in this book. So Vega becomes a mother. She has a little girl, Asha. And the book actually the first scene, chapter 1, is shortly after Vega realizes that she's pregnant. Then it moves through Asha's birth, her childhood years, and Vega's motherhood, similarly to the way that her grief works in the book, acts as a kind of psychological catalyst, I think. It reveals certain things about her character. It alters certain things about her character. So can you talk about your approach to thinking about motherhood in this book, and what did that offer you as a lens through which to look at Vega?
Yeah. I think, yeah, I don't know if I was aware of this when I was writing until again, I kind of cracked open the early drafts, but I think I was craving a story where motherhood was really pretty joyous. I mean, there are moments when it's not, and for Vega, for sure, there are moments when it's not. But overwhelmingly, she just really, really loves this kid, and that felt very natural to me in her story. If I had wanted it to be some sort of, if I wanted it to be a portrait of somebody who was struggling more with the shift in her identity, which is a valid human experience, and anything is a valid human experience. But if I had tried to capture that, I don't think I would have done it. I wouldn't have really done it well, because it made a lot of sense to me from the moment that she realizes that she's pregnant, the moment she begins envisioning this kid, and the moment this child arrives, that this is a really good shift in her life. That she's really happy, and I was happy to write that. It felt really nice. It felt natural for her.
Yeah, when after Asha is born, it's like she gains a new kind of clarity about everything in her life. Yeah, it's really beautifully rendered. I want to ask just one more question and then turn it over to the audience. Can you talk a little bit about the title, Habitations, and so how did you come to choose it, and what what important aspects of the book does that title point to for you?
I was on the phone with my friend Katie, who's sitting right here. And I said, Katie, I have no title. Let's just run through them. And she very patiently stayed on with me. And I think, jump in, Katie, if I'm missing anything. But I think that part of what I wanted to capture in this, and I felt it was a really hard book to title because there was no one symbol that represented the emotional or the journey she makes in terms of geography, in terms of emotions, in terms of personal growth. But she was just moving through places and really believing in them. And I think of her as doubly migratory. She's somebody who moves of her own volition to another country, but also by the nature of her work. She's an academic, and so her life is migratory. And there's this sense that she has, and I think a lot of us have, that you can move through a place and it can just be a stop, and you're not going to form attachments. It's not going to be meaningful to you. It's where you stop on the way to your way to the next thing. But we don't work that way. We're social beings. Our attachments are real. And I thought about all of the moments in her story that felt very real to me, where she smells something or sees something or hears something, and she's reminded of a place that she had no idea mattered to her at the time that she inhabited it. And there it is, and she would give anything to go back to it, but it's gone. The moment's gone. The place might be gone. And so I felt her realizing in retrospect how much those places she inhabited mattered.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Okay. Questions? Anybody have questions for Sheila? Yes.
I apologize in advance for not reading your book yet. But
You should. It's been out for about 8 hours.
I've read about it, but I'm really interested in the friendship part, which is critical as you addressed. And friendship is a spectrum. And you talk about, when I think of it, the friends about whom you've spoken in your book, is these are friends where one can show real vulnerability, deep friendships. And I'm wondering if she's had experience with what I would call limited friendship, without the vulnerability, but can also have an impact in our lives. You know, they're transient. I'm just curious if there's any of those sort of more peripheral people she encounters that.
Yeah. She has a lot of she makes a lot of bad romantic choices, and they were funny to write, and they were interesting, and they were kind of juicy and fun, but they're also, I think, quite telling of her ability to set the parameters around those. But the friends were really the people that she couldn't stop herself from falling in love with more deeply. Winshen and Cliff and other things. Am I talking? Oh, yes. Okay. Winshen, jump in.
Thanks, Sheila. Congratulations. I was curious because your book has so much, like even just the section you read, right? Like there's friendship, there's class, and commenting on, both like the present and how it's discussed in academia. We've gotten hints of like family, home, grief, motherhood. I was curious from one draft to the next, what was one of the biggest changes like that you made, either plot-wise or that for you personally, you were just like, oh, I didn't know that there was also going to be grief in here, right? Like if there's something you were resisting that came through from a draft to draft.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest shifts was when Vega became a little bit, when I moved her a little bit closer to the surface of the page. She was always kind of swimming beneath it. She was not, in the early draft, she was pretty reticent. She was hesitant to speak up. And when I was writing this, when I was envisioning it rather, I had in mind a character who was very different from a lot of the characters I read about, and books that I think my book stands on the shoulders of. And I had been really steeped in Jhumpa Lahiri's work, and she was a really big figure when I decided I wanted to be a writer. And the maternal figures in her book were always people whose intellect kind of ended at the borders of their native country. They didn't know how to carry that over to a new place. Partly it was time. Vega comes over at a time where the world is a bit more globally connected, so she has accessed ideas and political theory and novels and people outside of India. But when she in early drafts, I wasn't able to capture that. She was still somebody who she walked into a room, somebody would say something interesting, and she would do nothing. And I was like, well, why did I even put her in the room then if she's not going to do anything? So as I started revising more, and with each passing draft, she became a little bit more vocal. In early drafts, I didn't feel that she was a sociologist, which she is. That's an important part of the book, that she comes over to do her PhD in sociology, her master's initially, and then her doctorate, and she becomes an academic. And I didn't have that sense of her. I would tell readers over and over again that she was a sociologist, but you didn't feel it. And so I think that her reticence faded, and she started to realize with each passing draft that she kind of had a place at the table. And that was hard. It was really hard to do that. Thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, Cliff.
So I know you have Life in Mississippi and Life in New Orleans. I don't know how long ago you finished the book, but I wondered whether, process-wise, you wrote more of this in Mississippi and New Orleans, and if either of those places had any impact on either, the creative flow or the content of the story.
Yeah. I think it takes a long time for the meaning of a place to sink in. I didn't expect this to. Much of the novel is set in New Jersey, which is a place I wouldn't ever. It's where I grew up, but it's not a place that I thought I had deep attachments. It turns out I do, because it's 3/4 of the book. So, and then much of the book is also set in Chennai, which is a city that, though I've never lived there, it's a place where I have deep, deep family connections. And if I'd been asked to name the places that matter to me, I don't know that Chennai would have been in my top 3. But so you discover as you move your characters through the world, or at least I did as I moved Vega, or as I tried to read her to see where she would go next. I don't know that I always had control over it, over her choices. As she became clearer to me with each passing draft, I would follow her lead a little bit more than I would make the choice for her. But I do think she ended up going to places that mattered a lot to me, or places that, if not, I could really see why they mattered to her. And so probably in 20 years, in Mississippi I'll be ready to write my Mississippi book. I think it's going to take some distance sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, but also she lives in Louisiana.
But that is correct, Melissa. Which I could not, in early drafts, I tried to get her into New Orleans, and I couldn't do it. And I would overly explain it. I was like, she's taking the exit onto Claiborne, and she's on the 610 overpass. I would overly explain the geography of her life, because I was trying to convince myself, and I just wasn't able to get her to New Orleans. I don't think that had the distance. It didn't make sense to me that she would be there. It made much more sense to me that she would be in Baton Rouge, which is a place that, again, I like. It's pretty, but I don't. It's not. And I have deep family connections actually to Baton Rouge. But that I thought it made sense. Oh, why not move to the city I live in? Right. That I can control her better. But I actually wasn't able to pull it off. Those chapters didn't go flat.
It seems like to me that the character goes with your memory and your imagery and your memories, and they lock with your senses and your imagery and your memories, like memories and memorabilia, and it goes with your character's memory and her imagery, and that's what you're connecting with in memories in the past, and that's where she goes from, to habitation, to habitation, to habitation. And that's what you draw from and build upon with her character. And that's what I'm gathering.
Yeah.
And that's what, yes.
Yeah.
So that's what, and so see, she wouldn't go with her memories from where she'd been to those places yet, because your sensory palette and imagery is not there yet. And
yeah, maybe she's dreamier, and so I wasn't.
Yes,
until I dreamt
so
about a place I wasn't
that's
there.
kind of how you built your habitations, was from the sensory palette, the memory, the images, and the things that she sort of senses, the smells, the things that she goes from. And that's how memory is made, and that's how a story is made, through memory and senses.
Yeah.
Right. Is that sort of?
I think that's right.
I don't know if anybody else understood me, but
Maybe a couple more questions?
Yeah, I think so. Jill, hi.
Hi. I wonder this book started in you?
Yeah.
Was it Vega? Was it
Yeah.
a place?
Well, there was this. Why am I telling you this? This is not even in the book. I don't know why, but I've started. I have to tell it. So there was this wild story that my mother, who's kind of a wild storyteller, told me years ago. That was the seed for this book, and it was a story about a woman who was in her 70s and was living in India and came to the U.S. to visit her adult daughter, and she had this terrible marriage. And she told her adult daughter, like, I don't want to go back home. And the daughter said, well, let's just tell him you died. She basically staged this whole, and I don't know how they managed to pull it off for the next several decades, but in no place they disclose this woman is still alive. And so I really wanted to write that book. And draft after draft. It's so funny. But I couldn't, much like New Orleans, I couldn't get it because I believed that woman had done it. But there was something about like the emotional core of it that I wasn't able to touch. And so I would write so many drafts, and I Googled how you fake your own death, and I'm told that you never try to do it by drowning, so I was like, I'm just not going to drown. So I had all of these. And then I spent so much time on the sort of logistics of this really weighty decision. And then it was in many ways in scrapping that structure and that kind of inside joke I had with myself and my mom, that when I let that go, I started really asking myself, well, what makes you move? What makes us desperate to move to a new place? And then I did a lot of people watching and eavesdropping. I had this moment when I first moved to Oxford, actually, when I was doing something administrative, like I was at DMV or something, and there was this family there, and they were an immigrant family with this really young daughter, and I just hadn't studied an immigrant family for, I mean, I'm sure I have, but it was just us, and I was just watching them, and so much of, it was just so loving to watch them, and I think I realized in that moment, and I guess I had over the course of many years, how much I love immigrants. And that's a generalization. There are 300, 200, I don't know, 100 million people who immigrate every year across the world. There's a lot of them. It's hard to generalize. But there's something really beautiful about seeing people just trying this wild, impossible thing. And when I let go of this story that I thought was the seed, I did a lot of watching the people and realizing how much you love people and how much I love watching families. And that ended up, the emotional journey ended up driving it more than an idea.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.